I am super excited.
You have a bit of breaking news to bring to all of you.
First time U.S. men and women's national soccer players will get the same prize money. That's right.
I am feeling extreme pride. And to be able to say finally equal pay for equal work feels very, very good.
I'm super excited about it for all sorts of reasons. First, it just turns out that gender pay equality is a personal passion of mine. I've taught all sorts of negotiation workshops to professionals promoting pay equity between men and women. And I've just also had the opportunity to coach many women around really complicated gender pay equality issues. Now, the second reason why I'm super excited about this, I'm a negotiation nerd. And in particular, I favor negotiated agreements over lawsuits. And this is an example where negotiation actually triumphed over a lawsuit. So today, I'm going to share some key lessons from these negotiations. And if you stick around to the very end, you will hear a really key lesson that applies for negotiation, but has broader implications for all of our work. The first lesson here, right, is that great negotiators, they really play a long game when they're negotiating. You know, a lot of my videos, they focus on what to say or do at the negotiation table, and that's really important. But if you want to change something really big, like the pay structure of, let's say, professional sports, you need to be willing to really put in the time and play a longer game here. Back in 2016, when contract talks failed between the US women's team and US soccer, the women took on a new strategy. They actually fired their union chief, and they reorganized their union association in ways that gave the women themselves a much more active role to play in the actual negotiations and in the decision making. So what they did is they actually elected women players to be on the negotiating committees themselves. They also broadened the direct involvement of their members. And then they did this really key important thing, which is they prepared. They took courses on labor law, on contracts, on negotiation. Yes, on negotiation. And so what they were doing here by playing the long game is really three things. They increased the listening of their own constituents, and listening is a key negotiation skill. They removed what we call the principal agent tension in negotiation. So instead of hiring people to negotiate on their behalf, these women players were intimately involved in doing the negotiations themselves. And then they did deep preparation. And so all of this then leads to the second really important lesson, which is that great negotiators, they're playing a multi-front game all the time. So what do I mean by multi-front game? Well, it's simple, right? At the same time they're negotiating with the US Soccer Federation, they're also working to improve their BATNA through a more adversarial approach. So let me break this down a little bit more. First, after the new constituted negotiating team is established in 2017, they actually begin negotiations with unions, with U.S. Soccer, and actually reach a deal in 2017. Now, unfortunately, equal pay is not part of this deal, but they also negotiate something really important here, and that is that in this 2017 contract, the women also win control over some of their marketing and licensing rights. Part of what U.S. Soccer was saying in these earlier negotiations is the reason why we're not giving you equal pay is because there are major revenue differences between what men bring in and what women bring in. But now that the women were able to actually retain the rights to some of these negotiations, they were going to get the chance to actually test the women's team's market value on these very issues. So I'm going to come back to that when we get to my third lesson, but I want to stick to the other piece on multiple fronts here, because while the women have negotiated this major 2017 contract, they continue a second front, and that is in March of 2019. The U.S. women's team actually sues U.S. Soccer for gender discrimination. What they're trying to do there is improve their BATNA. A BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So in negotiation terms, it's what are we going to do if we don't reach an agreement with the other side? The learning point here, though, is we always want to be playing on multiple fronts in a negotiation. Speaking of multiple fronts, this leads to the third really important lesson. which is the importance of deploying external stakeholders and making appeals to normative values and criteria. Okay, I know that is a mouthful, so let me try to break it down a little bit. A key insight of great negotiators is that you have to focus on more than just the parties at the negotiation table. Who else does U.S. soccer care about who is not at this table? And this is where that point I brought up earlier really matters, right? The point about gaining control over licensing and marketing rights. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, what the women start to do is build a really powerful equal pay campaign. And they build this among fans, but also with some of the sponsors of both U.S. soccer and the U.S. women's team. And they do this by making appeals to both normative values that happen to be surging in our society at the moment around the importance of gender equality and pay equality, and also by harnessing information about criteria around pay. Even before the women win the World Cup in 2019, what they have done is leverage some of these external stakeholders to their advantage. So specifically, Lunabar announces before the 2019 World Cup its intention to pay each woman who makes the U.S. World Cup team a bonus of $31,250. Now, that is not a random number. You know what that number is? It's the difference between the bonus that U.S. soccer was going to pay the men who made the World Cup versus what they were going to pay the women. In addition, Visa announces a 5-year sponsorship of U.S. soccer, but it's not without strings attached, because part of the caveat in that is that at least half of that $5 million must be directed to the women's national team. Then, after the women win the World Cup in 2019, Nike produces a 60-second commercial stressing equality for women's sports. And then the big kahuna here is Procter & Gamble donates more than $500,000 to the Women's Players Association, urging the U.S. Soccer Federation to, quote, be on the right side of history. So by using normative values around equality and equity, and by developing this very strategic campaign to influence external stakeholders, what the women have fundamentally done is shifted this negotiation. Okay, we're going to move to the fourth lesson. You know, most of what I've been telling you about are the really brilliant things that the Women's Players Association did, but this fourth lesson is actually something great that U.S. soccer did. And that lesson is when you have leverage, don't gloat. Instead, work to build a long-term relationship. You remember that lawsuit I told you about? Well, in April of 2020, a federal judge actually dismissed the lawsuit, ruling in favor of U.S. soccer and against the women. Now, if you are U.S. soccer in that moment, and you're on the winning side of this case, it is really tempting to lean back and say, ha, but that is not what happens. And that's because in the intervening period, U.S. soccer got a new president. That president was actually a former player herself, and her name was Cindy Parlow Cohn. And you know what she does next in this moment? She doesn't gloat. She doesn't celebrate. She does something really brilliant. She extends an olive branch. We look forward to working with the women's national team to chart a positive path forward to grow the game both here at home and around the world. Totally counterintuitive. But she knows that in this moment, we're either going to continue the bitterness or we're going to build a new relationship. And all wise negotiators, when they can, they choose that latter course. They hit the reset button. Now, this equal pay agreement is historic for so many reasons, but particularly because FIFA, which is the international body that runs the World Cup, it turns out FIFA is not going to pay equal amounts of prize money to the women and the men. In fact, in 2019, they made available $30 million in prize money to the women. This year in the World Cup, FIFA will make available to the men $450 million. But the agreement between U.S. soccer and the U.S. women's team and the U.S. men's team is that all of those monies will be shared equally. And that is historic. And that leads to this last really important lesson that applies in negotiation, but frankly applies in all life. And it's just be excellent in all you do. Because while I would like to say 100% of the reason why the women got what they got here, is because they're great negotiators, that's not entirely true. It's also just the case that the women's team, they're damn good soccer players. And so whenever you're negotiating, you obviously want to have the skills at the table. And you also want to be excellent at whatever it is you are negotiating about. And in this case, right, the women were simply just that. You know, there's this really cheesy phrase, if you've ever been in an airplane and looking at the In-Flight magazine, there's a firm that sells these negotiation trainings. And the phrase in their advertising says, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And you know what? That's absolutely true. But here's something else that's true. You can't negotiate what you don't deserve. So if you want to get some tips from someone else who is excellent at what he does and who has negotiated more than anyone could have imagined, please stay tuned and look at this next video on what makes Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a truly great negotiator. And of course, I'd be super grateful if you could subscribe to my channel, like the video, and hit the bell. Okay, Zelensky has a lot to teach us, so keep on watching.